Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners, I'm going to show you how to orchestrate your piano sketches, and if you stick around to the end, I will show you a huge mistake I made that cost me 2 to 3 hours of work. Let's begin. I'd like to start with the wisdom of Charles Koechlin. He was a major orchestration expert in France, and he wrote what I consider to be the best orchestration manual. I am translating some of the key moments, and this is from volume 4, and a specific section in which he talks about how to orchestrate your piano scores. Au sujet de la quinte de notes graves et plus généralement des dispositions assez serrées près de la basse, on en trouve assez souvent au piano. Il n'en va plus de même à l'orchestre où les bassons, les violoncelles et surtout les contrebasses donnent beaucoup de l'odeur écrit en notes rapprochées. Si l'on veut un double forte bien sonore et qui reste clair et éclatant, il faut se méfier de la quinte de notes graves. Vous ne la trouverez autant dire jamais dans les symphonies de Mozart, de Beethoven, de Mendelssohn, de moi, forte. So what is Charles Koechlin really saying? What he's saying, to sum it up, is that when you have perfect fifths or even tightly spaced intervals in the left hand of the piano, though it sounds excellent on the piano, when you're orchestrating that, if you do a literal copy and paste, it is not going to be the same effect, and it'll probably sound much darker, heavier, and it kind of crasser than you would want it to be. For example, here is a passage from the end of a Beethoven sonata. And let's say I want to orchestrate these last two chords. So you'll notice that the bass, the left hand of the piano, is very tightly spaced in a low register, especially the last chord. If I try to copy and paste that for the orchestra, it will not have the same effect. It will be very unpleasant. For example, if I were to give that to the bassoons, okay, that's really heavy. It doesn't mean you can't use it. It won't work in another scenario, but that's not how Beethoven would have done it. Okay, it doesn't have the elegance and that crispness that we love, you know, in the classical style. If I were to distribute it amongst the cellos and the double basses, it's like, you know, it's grindy, it's kind of aggressive, okay? And again, it can work. It's not like it's a bad orchestration on its own, but it is not a faithful kind of reimagining of what Beethoven had. So this brings me to the first concept that I want to bring to your attention, and it's when you are orchestrating your piano scores, it is not a copy and paste. It is a reimagining. In fact, it is it's composition. So let's say I wanted to orchestrate these last couple chords. How might I go about it? Let's look at my first attempt. First thing is notice that what previously was that tight triad in the left hand has been completely eliminated and replaced by a triple octave bass. I think this actually captures the spirit of that chord, because if I had to put that chord the way Beethoven had it on piano into words, there's something like really assertive, it's bold, it's in your face, and I think this orchestration comes close to it. Now, obviously this is only strings. Notice what was in the right hand of the piano, these tall chords. When I look at that, automatically I'm thinking, okay, that has to be triple and quadruple stops for the strings. So a lot of his symphonies will start or end, or some of the key moments, even within it, they'll have these like, you know, those triple, quadruple stops. Also Mozart and Haydn, so it's very characteristic of the time period. So that's another thing when you're orchestrating someone else's work, you want to be, you know, cognizant of the tendencies of the time period. So I'm trying to capture that in the strings. So look what I did. Okay. Now, one thing you will have to do is you may have to do research, okay? Because I don't know the best positions for triple stops and quadruple stops for the violins. I did play cello in my youth, but, you know, I'm not totally sure on that. So in this case, it is your job to do that research, okay? Especially if you want these effects in your own pieces. You're going to have to set some extra time, not in the middle of orchestrating because you don't want to lose the flow, but you want to go ahead and figure out how what are some good double stops in those keys. So what I did, now obviously you can go to an orchestration book, I'm sure they have it as well, but the problem there is if you don't know how to use it, you might lose time, okay? So what I did was the most efficient is I set aside time to just double check in the literature. So I got Beethoven, some Mozart, and I looked through symphonies. Now, what are the chords that we need? We have a 5-1 in C major. So we need to know what possible chords, G major chords, distribution, or a C major chord, both, okay? So the first thing I did is I actually went to the C minor symphony, which is the Fifth Symphony, the very famous one, right? Because the ending is in C major. So I looked at the ending, and some of these quadruple stops or triple stops that you see, I literally stole from Beethoven. Shall we say, okay? I also looked in the F major symphony, the second one, the number 8, but maybe there are some, but I didn't see some right away, and I was kind of urgent. So then I went to the Pastoral Symphony, and I definitely found some at the ending of the first movement. One other important thing is that you have to be flexible, right? Because notice that though I needed a C chord and a G chord, notice that I didn't limit myself to C major, right? I guess I could have checked the First Symphony, but I had to think strategically. For example, the 5 is a G major chord. So in the Fifth Symphony, which is in C minor at first, though the C minor chord I can't use because I need a major chord, the 5 in C minor is still the same 5 in C major, which is a G major chord. So I looked in the beginning of the 5 and I found great voicings. In particular, I found the voicing that I need for this sketch. Now, before we get to that voicing, I want to show you my second attempt. So notice that I didn't complete this, and I think the reason why is because I started with the violas, and I just got a little bit discouraged or lost interest. And this is important when you're composing because you have to figure out why is this happening. This is just happening because you're going, for me at least, I'm going down a path that doesn't really interest me. And it just, I don't know, like it feels too scholastic, scolaire, as they say in French. So I kind of abandoned it. You can see I attempted the flute and I wasn't feeling it, okay? So then my third attempt, okay, to me this is it, okay? This is it, okay? So notice that I used some of the voicings that I did research on. If you look at my first sketch, notice I was close in the ballpark. But one of the reasons I didn't have this final solution, I didn't know like a perfect fifth is part of a double stop or a triple stop or quadruple stop was feasible because I know there's always intonation problems. But Beethoven has it, and clearly he really knew how to write for strings, especially for the triple quadruple stops. So that told me this is now available. Notice that in this orchestration as well, to get that tight feeling that we had on the piano, that really assertive quality, especially through that, the left hand of the piano, again, I did not add those partials in the lower part of the chord. Again, I just have sol, do, okay? In addition, I still have the viola, so we have a triple bass, and I think that gets the assertive quality that we need. Obviously, I have to fill this in with the other voices, and I think there are a vast array of ways that you could orchestrate this chord effectively. Another thing to think about is the context, okay? So depending on what's coming next, what's coming afterwards, it may affect your choices. We have a slow movement coming up, so maybe it'll affect what instruments we don't know, okay? Now, I hope that this is ringing to you because when you're orchestrating, you have to think about how this is going to work for the actual orchestra. Otherwise, you're going to use a lot of time, which we'll be talking about through this episode. If you want to read this entire passage about how Charles Koechlin talks about the perfect fifth, it's really, really important. I think it is one of the top 3 to 5, definitely within the top 10 passages in his orchestration manual. I have made it available on my website for free. If you go to barneyjmusic.com/orchestration, scroll to the bottom to resources, and I put the translation from the French into English. You can consult it at your leisure. Okay, now we're going to orchestrate. So my strategy right now is I want to get out of the piano sketches as quickly as possible. I'm saying this from painful experience because I composed and orchestrated a symphony. I re-orchestrated after I got more knowledge in France, and it was so expensive on my time. I was fortunate I didn't have to work full time at the time, so I was able to take that expense. But now I'm a bit older and I cannot afford to spend I can't fit it in. Okay, so I want to think how I can, refine it and be quicker. And what I can tell you for sure is getting out of the piano drafts as quick as possible is essential. You do need to spend time, of course, composing the entire piece. You need to know the form, so you need to sketch out the entire piece. That is for sure. But sooner rather than later, you need to get your feet wet, because when you actually orchestrate, you're going to find out it's a completely different beast. For example, when I was orchestrating my symphony the first time, it was originally one movement. I was in the way for orchestra, okay, just one movement. And it was 9 minutes. I was like, okay, I've composed 9-minute pieces before. And so, I don't know, maybe it took me 3 months, it took me 6 months. And I thought, okay, I'll just orchestrate it, a couple of weeks. But no. The orchestration, it took, 50 times more energy. And then, of course, I ended up expanding it into an entire symphony. But the point I'm trying to make is that the real work and labor and sweat, it's suffering. It's a beautiful type of suffering, but it is a lot of work. The amount of work and energy you have to put in to orchestrate, you have to think of the energy it would take to win a war, right? A whole nation to win a war, maybe not a war, but you have to think of that intensity of so much energy. And it's not even about concentration. It's about going at it, just doing this detail, this tiny detail. I found this tiny mistake. There's so much work everywhere. It's like managing a kingdom. So because of that, I need to get out of the piano sketches as quickly as possible and get into the really nitty-gritty, which is the orchestration. So my plan is I'm going to, this is a piece that came to me from my opera ballet. Luckily, it functions as a standalone, but I need to capture the melody as quickly as possible. Let's listen. Okay, so one of the things I definitely need, of course, is the melody so I can mark it in the orchestrated copy. I need to make sure I have accurate note values and rhythms and all that, because the last thing you want to do is actually orchestrate. And of course, we orchestrate by hand, right? You cannot orchestrate on a computer. It gives you bad information. You're not thinking. It may feel pleasurable to hear instant results, but you will never compose a masterwork on the computer. It is impossible. You have to orchestrate by hand if you really want to really do the real work of a real composer. It's got to be by hand. It just has to be by hand. I don't see how a masterwork can be done on the computer. Sorry. So one of the things you really have to think about is you don't want to make mistakes or kind of be unsure about what you want to do, and then you start orchestrating, and then you have to erase, and you already orchestrate. It's just, so you have to be efficient. So you need all the note values. You need everything to be squared away. I have the melody I want. Notice that I put some indications of instruments I'm hearing. So I have the cellos for sure. I put plus low brass. Okay, so I'm hearing a low brass sound. Then I put cello. So maybe that means I hear just the cello there. Later, I see plus double bass. That means probably the double bass will be coming down an octave lower. We have all kinds of shorthands on our piano score. Notice in the new section, I have a harp, right? So we had a 2-hand piano, and suddenly it's 4-hand. So that means I'm definitely hearing that instrument. So it's never going to be a pure piano score. It's just 2 hands or just 4 hands. Sometimes I have like 6-hand piano. Whatever you need to do to hear the stuff that's essential to you, that's what you got to do. Notice that I have a melody in the top voice, and notice the distribution of the chord. So you'll notice it's a D major chord. We're in G minor, so it's the 5, and we have a doubled third. Notice that the D in between the A and F sharp is not filled in. So that means there's a specificity in terms of what I'm hearing. So that chord, I'm hearing a certain richness. And when we orchestrate this, we want to preserve that richness. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to orchestrate this first section. It's really a live section. I want to start sampling it. I want to start promoting my opera ballet. So I want like one of the flashy sections, okay? But before I can orchestrate it, I'm actually going to orchestrate the next section. Listen again. And the reason for that is in order to orchestrate effectively, I have to know what's coming before and what's coming afterwards. What I don't want to do is spend all this time orchestrating the first section. It's amazing. And then when I get to the next section, I need to use the same exact instruments that I'm featuring, so there's kind of a dullness or it feels like the same. So for that reason, I'm just going to like dabble a little bit. I'm not going to do a final orchestration, but I want to figure out what's going on in this new section. Let's listen. All right, so a couple of things. So in the piano score, in the left hand, we had those chords, and notice how it fits perfectly with the trombones. I think probably as I was even drafting the piano score, I was probably already hearing that, but it works really nicely. Notice the melody. Okay, we have the violins. And they're doubled by the French horns. So I was hearing a very Rameau, one of these French Baroque composers, that kind of opera composer that's really full, homogeneous sound. I was really hearing that. Also notice that when previously we were talking about the uniqueness of it's not that unique, but there was something intentional, or I was hearing in the spacing of the chords where we had the doubled third and we didn't fill in the D. Notice that in the orchestrated version, I actually filled in that D. What? Okay, so again, remember the central message I said with Charles Koechlin. We can forget about the whole thing about the fifth right now. That's important, but the central message is what? The central message is that when you are orchestrating, you have to imagine, you have to reimagine. It's not a sacred document. You have to, how will this achieve that effect? So that kind of lush feeling I got when I had that doubled third and I had that space, I got this way. So notice that we have the second violin's divisi on these rustic fourths, which fits into my style of the piece. Notice that the cello is on that middle D. In the piano score, we had the harp part. I had, the D, the octave below. So again, the score isn't sacred. So obviously when I started orchestrating, I was just hearing more acutely, and it said I don't want that low D. Notice that the violas are on that F sharp. So though they're not doubling the melody exactly, okay, from a harmonic perspective, they are doubling the violins. So that kind of emphasis that I had on the third has still been preserved. Now, certainly, many composers would do differently, okay? You orchestrate differently, but this is my piece, and this is what I'm hearing, okay? Now we have to talk about the harp. So as I was doing this piano sketch, I know I want a harp, okay? Obviously, I wrote it out, okay? And in fact, this is un dehors, which means you bring out the harp, okay, in the piano copy. But I wasn't sure about the harp writing. I've definitely written for harp before. It's been about 3 or 4 years since I've last composed for harp. And I'm always just a little bit unsure. I always have to do extra research. And quite frankly, this is part of your job, okay? The one thing is when you encounter this, it's best to make a note for yourself. I don't recommend stopping what you're doing. Oh, well, now I got to research the harp. And then you lose that flow and momentum. But definitely you need to book a time where you can double check, okay? And particularly with the harp, what I can remember off the top of my head is that they like to move in figures of 4 because they don't really use the thumb. Okay, so therefore, like something based on 5, scales can be kind of awkward. Anything with 5 is just not very natural. So I want to make sure that this is idiomatic, right? That's how your music actually sounds good, when it's idiomatic, when it sounds natural. So never think that, oh, well, this is my idea, is absolute, it comes first, and then the other pieces, the performers have to adapt. No, you have your central idea, but it can adapt to whatever instrument you're writing for. We see that already with orchestration, right, with the Beethoven, right? We had that tightly spaced chord in the bottom, but when we orchestrated, we found something that was different, but in a way it was the same, okay? It captured the spirit. So with this harp, I set aside some time to do some research, okay? Now, before I did that, I was still in the middle of composing the piano score. I wanted to get moving. So I said, well, what if it's not going to work out with the harp? Okay, I need to have a backup plan, okay? So I listened, like, what instrument could kind of do this figure and maybe not sound like a harp, but achieve that effect? So I listened, and this is an opera ballet. So definitely in ballet, we have these intimate sections, you know, where the lovers are uniting or whatever, and sometimes it's a harp, but also it could be a violin, a solo violinist. And I said, you know what, actually, I could hear a solo violinist. Now, look at the range that is put in this piano sketch. It's just a sketch, okay? I think if I were to do a copy and paste of that for the violin, it would be kind of dull. It's not the brilliant register. So if I end up using this backup version and doing it in the violin, I probably will have to respace, you know, put the arpeggios up at a higher register, change just change things around, maybe change the voicing of the other instruments. But definitely for me, it was a viable alternative. Later, I did my research. An important thing I did when I did my research is I put a time limit, because one of the dangers we get into is that we feel so insecure when we're orchestrating that we want to load up on the knowledge. Okay, I want to feel prepared. So it's like going to battle. I want to load up on all the ammunition I need. But the reality is you're never going to be totally prepared. You really learn by doing. So that's why I said I can't afford to go down a rabbit hole. As amazing as rabbit holes are, right? When you study Beethoven, you're like, oh, it's amazing, you know, several hours. I can't afford it. So I put a limit. I think it's 20 or 30 minutes. That's it. Okay. So what I did is I know Tchaikovsky writes really well for harp. I'd just been to a ballet. I'd seen Swan Lake. It was amazing. And so what I did is I went to IMSLP. We all know that website. And I looked up the work and I looked for the harp part, because for some of the works in IMSLP, you can find like the individual part. That way you don't have to waste all your time, you know, scrolling for all those pages, right? It's just all the harp. So then I think I went to Spotify or something, and I listened to a recording and just looked at the harp part, looked at the writing. And then after about 20 minutes, I was able to determine, in fact, the writing I had for harp is totally fine. It's very doable. It's very normal. There's nothing to worry. Pas de souci, as we say in French. So now in this orchestrated version, notice again, going back to the Charles Koechlin, the point I brought to you about the Charles Koechlin was not about the perfect fifth. That is really important. That is technical, okay? But what he's pointing out is you have to reimagine. You have to hear what it's going to sound like for orchestra. So notice when I actually orchestrated, I put the harp in a higher register. Right? It just has that brilliant quality that I was originally hearing. But of course, when you're doing your piano sketches, it's surface level. But it's important. It's not like it's not, you know, it's superficial, but you really are scratching the surface. And again, this is why I didn't want to get sucked up in the piano score. Even though there's actually other sections that I haven't finished, you know, doing all the melodies, I was like, I can't risk it. I at least got to know, kind of have an idea of how it's going to work. All right, so now we have to start really, really listening like an orchestrator if we hadn't already been doing so. Because remember, I cannot afford to spend hours and hours and hours doing something that could be reduced if I do some major planning. So I need to get the accompaniment. And one of the dangers when you're using Piano Sketch is that you're going to compose something for the accompaniment that works well on the piano score for piano, but will not translate very well for orchestra, and it's going to be really messy. Usually you can find a way, but I don't want messy. I want it to work immediately. So to illustrate this, I'm going to show you another excerpt from my opera ballet Salambo. This is from the first completed fugue. It's called The Return of Hamilcar for a children's chorus, but I've orchestrated for strings. So let's listen to the development, but with the piano. Okay, so I want to specifically focus on the left hand. Listen to the left hand. Okay, so it's really quick and it's in a low register. Okay, so the first thing is notice the chords. So I separate a piece of paper, I figure out the chords. And of course, it's a little bit different than hearing them pass through time, but nevertheless, that is the harmony of the left hand. And notice how it's very tightly spaced in a low register. So what did we learn from Charles Koechlin? We're probably going to have to respace that or do something, otherwise it would be trop lourd, as the French would say. In addition, notice the range of its first note, right? That low B, the cellos are not going to be able to hit. If I were to give this line to the double bass directly, it is impossible, okay? It's just, even if technically a double bassist could do it up to tempo, it's not going to sound good. Okay, and one of the things I see, especially just in composition in general for less experienced composers, is they write things that are impossible. One of the reasons why is because they're using a computer. Okay, and it's possible in the computer, but it's not possible. Or they write something that technically is possible, but it would require exceptional technique and not getting nervous and being in perfect, health, and nothing goes wrong. Okay, and you have to allow for, anything could happen. So this is just not a reasonable line for the double bass. Now I could maybe give it to the cello. I'll have to figure about that low B, but still it's just way too fast. And we also have the issue of those pitches in that register. So let's look at my orchestrated solution. So notice that I've given that line that was formerly, 16th notes. Now it is eighth notes in the double bass. Okay, and definitely for me, it still has the same effect. Now this gets subjective, right? Okay, but I needed something chaotic, and for me, having a quick moving bass, you just think about Bach. It can create. It never feels like chaos in Bach, but it definitely feels like energized, okay? So I figured out the bass. Notice which pitches I have the bass on. So though it's doing eighth notes, it's not doing the corresponding 16th note where that would occur, if that makes sense. So in the piano version, the first eighth and the third eighth, we have a B and F sharp on that first B. But then for the double bass line, it's B and D. So why is that? Well, I'll just say I had to hear it. Okay, and I don't remember what was going specifically in my head when I was doing this piano version. I definitely knew it would become an orchestra piece, but I was definitely thinking pianistically as well, because this will be, rehearsed with a real actual pianist. But definitely, I would imagine I would have tested this out. So when you're, orchestrating or composing something with piano, and you like it, like this is I love this. This is this crazy, I love it, okay? And I love it. So when you love it, you got to work with it, okay? But you want to quickly figure out how it's going to work. So what I would recommend in that situation, you have some crazy piano lick like that, and it sounds great. Immediately, or set a time, if you're in flow and you want to stay in the flow, but you guys set a time or immediately test it out. So get a separate piece of paper and just arrange it. You don't have to do all the staves, but in this case, it's going to be orchestrated for string orchestra. So just how am I going to distribute it? Find a schema that works, okay? Notice that the harmony changes, the basic lick is the same. So if you find a good setup, it should work for the entire time. Notice what I did with the violas. Okay, so they're preserving that chaotic feeling with the 16th notes. Okay, though they're not always on a fourth, they're moving around. And they're also functioning to fill in the chord in that middle register, which may have been lost in the original piano score. So again, if you have to translate, it's like a translation, but it grows. It's not a literal copy and paste. You have to reimagine. And notice what I did with the cellos. Okay, now definitely this, I think it'll be a little tricky, right? It's definitely it's just kind of a little awkward, but it's definitely what I'm hearing. There's something really aggressive I'm hearing. So that kind of aggressive, chaotic quality that I had in the piano version, I had to transform that when I orchestrated it. Again, there are many different ways that people would handle a similar problem in a different manner, but it's up to you. And the important thing is that it's still composition, right? This double bass line, in fact, I had no idea this would come out, but this is why I started, I have to test the orchestration. I had to get out of the piano score and figure how is it going to work? Now, of course, this is from a separate piece. This is not the main piece I'm showing today, but that skill that I'm showing you is everywhere. And this is coming from experience. It's just orchestration is so expensive. It's so expensive on your time. You cannot afford, I mean, yes, experience is great. You know, you learn the hard way and you learn not to do that mistake again. But, you know, once you get a little more experienced or you're just starting to see, okay, I'm just never going to finish this piece, you have to think for yourself, how can I reduce this? How can I be a little bit more organized? How can I be a little more responsible, in fact, right? To test, don't just say, oh, it's going to work out. That doesn't work. With composition, there's a technique aspect, there's a creative aspect, but it doesn't just work out. Working out means you have a mediocre piece, or it's not really what you want, or it's good-ish, but there's so many problems that you can't get to the true musicality. You need to make sure it's idiomatic, and you should make sure the orchestration is well balanced. And that comes from thinking in advance. Now, let me show you, going back to the main piece we're orchestrating, the celebration dances from my upper bass Salembo. Let me show you a poor accompaniment. So this is an example here of the perfect fifths of something you would do on piano, right? Because a rapid perfect fifth is very easy to do on the piano, but orchestration is a disaster. I mean, just what instrument can do it? Seriously, what instrument can do it? One of the dangers for us, I know especially, not even just orchestration, but with beginner composers, is they have this idea and they can't adapt the idea, all right? And this is it's way too fast. It's like no string instrument can do it because they're going to have to rotate across the strings. First of all, you're going to intonation differences because the strings get out of tune over the course of the piece. But more importantly, it's just going to be really, really sloppy. It's not what you actually want. It is not a faithful transformation of what, the company needs to be. And the second thing I sketched out, better, right? It's a perfect fourth, so it's much more doable. But again, for me, it's something that you compose when you're listening at the piano and you're not already imagining how it's going to work out for the orchestra. You don't have to have all the details worked out, but you definitely have to have some kind of plan. Like, you need to test it, like what instrument can do it. I want to take a quick second to mention a really important question that many of you may be having, or definitely I had when I was orchestrating for the very first time, and it's, how do I get better orchestration right now? Okay, so you'll know from my many, many, many rants on this channel that the real long-term investment, you have to get better harmony, not intellectually, but like in your fingers, how the French do it, building above and below. That gives you the ear. It allows you to hear the doublings that you want. It just makes life more enjoyable, much easier, especially for fugue as well, orchestration especially. So long-term investment is certainly that, okay? Now the medium-term investment, of course, would be orchestration classes in the French style. I think I have a shorts video series out, and I'll be having more throughout the semester, next semester, showing you how the French learn harmony. They have a piano score that you're assigned, part of a Mozart piano sonata, and then you orchestrate it, and then your teacher gets feedback, and you really learn, and it's a really amazing way, very structured, and it will get you in shape. I don't think it's the final piece of the puzzle, but it's much better than just like looking at scores and talking about how amazing these composers are, okay? But suppose you don't have time for that, right? You are working on an orchestration piece right now, and though you want to address it in a more responsible manner in the future, you need to orchestrate, okay? So if I were in this position right now and it's just like, I need to orchestrate, I have to finish this piece, but I don't feel like I have all the pieces of the puzzle, what I would do is I would start going to live concerts. I would immediately go, I live near New York City, so I could like book a ticket, New York Phil, and hear live music, Okay, so when I was reorchestrating my symphony, Help Is on the Way, at first in America, I didn't have harmony, didn't have the chops, and I just didn't really feel like I knew what I was doing. So eventually I moved to France to get real training in harmony. And then when I was there, I was revising it, and I was going to the opera a lot. Okay, and opera has a lot of music, like 3 hours of continuous music, except for maybe the intermission. And what I noticed, is when I went to hear live music, opera or concert, but it was live. When I went to orchestrate, my hearing was sharper. It wasn't an intentional effect. Maybe it won't work if you intentionally do it looking for benefit. I don't know, but it's something I noticed. So if you're in a bind and you need to get better orchestration, I would highly recommend listening to live music, not recording music. You have to go there. It's about being there, seeing the instruments, hearing the instruments. I don't think it even has to be an orchestra, though it makes more sense that it's an orchestra, maybe jazz. It definitely does not have to be professional musicians. It could be amateur musicians, but just hearing those sounds is really going to wake up the ear. All right, so now I want to get the accompaniment, but based off the information provided, I want to make sure that I get an accompaniment for this melody that actually works for orchestra. So I want to hear directly for orchestra. I cannot afford to dibble and dabble at piano and then try to translate and work, no, I want to get it directly. So what I did is I just listened, right? The way you would listen, okay, I gotta get the ending of this piece or for a chamber piece or whatever, just it's composition, okay? So I listened. And notice that this lick here, okay, it is not idiomatic for piano, right? It would hurt the hands. It's just not natural. It's not really possible for piano. However, for orchestra, it is excellent. So one of the things that's really great here is this could work really great for strings, right? Lots of them, they can play endlessly. It's very easy to do. If someone gets exhausted, of course, when someone's taking a break. It's very easy to do for strings. Also, it works really well for brass. Brass will shine. They love showing off their triple tonguing, their double tonguing. It's just going to be really, really exciting. So what I have here is I have something that's, quote, very profitable, shall we say, meaning I have a lot of possibilities. And because of that, it's going to make orchestrating much freer, okay? So you see what happens when I haven't listened to what degree what instruments are playing, but I'm just listening for the general effect. So you see what happens when you try to get out of the piano score and you start thinking directly for the orchestra. I have this kind of comfort knowing, okay, if it doesn't work out with this instrument, it's going to work out with this. If this balance doesn't work, I'm going to have a lot of possibilities, okay? Now, if this is your first time orchestrating or you're still new to it or you're struggling, some of these things I'm presenting, you can't apply it right away. It's going to throw you off, and I don't want to throw you off, but it's really something to start thinking about. The essential thing is just like hearing directly for the orchestra. And this is what I call unnatural writing for piano equals great writing for orchestra. Now, it's not an absolute rule, but there's many times where things on the piano that you wouldn't naturally produce just improvising, would actually sound really good for orchestra. So the key, again, is to think what is natural for orchestra, and as much as you can, start getting it directly. We don't want to waste time like converting it and figuring how it just, get it right away if you can, okay? And this brings me to a point I want to mention about Liszt and his piano transcriptions of the Beethoven symphonies. They're awesome, okay? They're awesome, okay? It's amazing. They're technically impossible. I think very few people can really do them well. It's just, but I have to say, having heard them, and there's some great ones on YouTube and they're great performances, there are certain parts that were not meant for piano. They do not sound good. Do not sound good at all for piano. For example, in the Pastoral Symphony, in the Storm movement, where, the screaming chords that we love from Beethoven that are just so simple and direct. Don't ever let anyone tell you that, arpeggios or like just a chord, is that's not interesting. No, look at Beethoven, it was just a chord, diminished chords or whatever chords he had. Okay, so that sounds amazing for orchestra, but I have not heard a good rendition for piano. I mean, because you can't change the rhythm, you got to keep it. And first of all, you're going to hurt people's ears. It's probably bad for the piano. It's bad for your fingers. It really does not sound good for piano. So this is an indication that Beethoven was hearing directly for orchestra. Okay, sure, he used piano, harpsichord, whatever he used, okay, to help him a little bit, but he was thinking direct line for orchestra. He was not thinking, oh, maybe, piano, convert. No. He was hearing directly for orchestra. So be careful when you're orchestrating that you don't get confused between what sounds good for piano and what is really excellent for orchestra. Another really good example is from the same symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, which of course I love. It's a model symphony. And it's 5 movements, just like my symphony, Accompaniment for orchestra. Now, if you go to the development of the Pastoral Symphony, the 6th Symphony by Beethoven, a little bit after, the repeat sign, a little bit inward, let's listen to it. So direct, so simple, so beautiful. Don't let anyone tell you have to do all these crazy things to have a great piece. It's direct and simple. It is a rebuttal to all the lies people are putting out there. You have arpeggio, blah, blah. It's a complete rebuttal. Okay, simple and direct. Okay, it's just amazing. All right. Now, if we were to play this on piano, it would not be nearly as interesting, right? Because we have 4 bars of the same motif, okay, in the first violins. Okay, then we have it in the second violin's same register, right? Same, but there's gonna be a timbral difference. How clever, okay? Because the second violins will be a little softer. Plus, of course, it's doubled by the flute up the octave. Then, after 4 measures, it goes back to the first violins, but on a different partial. Okay, so on a piano, yeah, it would keep our attention enough, but we would definitely feel like, and I think these Beethoven transcriptions, though they are successful, people like them. I think we like them because we know the original symphony. It's just like, okay, we can save money and just hear, a cheaper version. But the reality is, this was conceived directly for orchestra. All right, so start orchestrating before you're ready. So one of the grave dangers we're going to end up in is that we want to feel ready. You want to feel prepared. But unfortunately, when it comes to composition, orchestration, there's no amount of preparation that's going to get you prepared. At a certain point, you have to jump in. So we'll look at the score. So see, I orchestrated the melody. I put it in the cellos and double basses as I expected. I also doubled them with the trombones and tuba. Now, I don't yet know specifically the balance, okay? That'll probably come later, like how many trombones. For now, I have 2. I've kind of marked down the strings, lower strings. I said let brass sound dominate. Maybe I'll remove that and, change the orchestration so it naturally gives us that. But I'm definitely hearing what I want so far. Now let's look at the accompaniment. So I put it directly in the strings. It's going to work really well for the strings. Now notice I didn't put it in the brass. And the reason for that is, though it does work well for brass, the thing to remember is that this is going to be supposed to be continuous. And at a certain point, right, you have to take a breath. And so with brass, that is a real issue. And we have 3 trumpets. So in theory, you could say, well, maybe I can distribute the trumpets so one is resting and the others are playing, and then, somehow orchestrate it so it works. And that is part of your job, it's part of your skill, part of your bag of tricks. But here, if we look at the piano accompaniment score, I was definitely hearing like CGC, like this whole as a unit, okay? And just have 2 trumpets doing a part of it, it's just not going to capture it. Now, that's just subjective. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the trumpets here, if they were to be playing, they would be the highest voice, okay? Because the bass is in the lower the melodies and lower in the basses. So therefore, if you have breaks in the sound in the upper voices, we're definitely going to hear that. I want to talk about something really important, because when we orchestrate, we sometimes become obsessed with, purity and thinking something is the Bible. And this is definitely one of the critiques I have of the French method of learning orchestration, which I hope that you do get to do at some point, because it will get you ready. But one of the problems is you can't take risks, right? So what we've seen so far, and what we're going to see coming up, is that when we're getting out of the piano score and we're actually orchestrating, there are times we have to actually compose something new, right? The example that I showed from my fugue with that bass, that really fast lick, and we had to transform it, right? How could you have gotten that just being stuck in the piano score? It's when you get into nitty gritty. Now, one of the problems with the French method, okay, it's one of the blessings and the curse, is because it's someone else's work, Mozart, it gets very delicate very quickly, you're composing, doesn't sound like Mozart. But then one of the problems is you can hear some of these orchestrations, of his piano sonatas, and there's something missing from it, right? It just doesn't really, it's correct, it's well balanced, well orchestrated, but somehow it doesn't have that magic. So the thing to remember is that orchestration is composition, okay? I know sometimes they say orchestration is harmony, which it is, but also it is composition. It is not the case that you compose first and then you orchestrate, and they're two separate skills, okay? It may seem like that, and when you do French orchestration, it kind of is like that, but that's why I say it doesn't fully prepare you, because as you're seeing and that you're going to see, it is composition at every step of the way. So the best way to think about it is, I think the piano score or sketch is meant to inspire you, right? So you capture those ideas. Yes, you need to do some kind of sketch so you get the whole form of the piece, and you get that's the quickest way. But then when you're orchestrating, you're listening for the orchestra. Remember what Charles Koechlin said. Okay, you're listening to the orchestra from your piano score. That is your guide, but you are ultimately the leader. Okay, now we're going to discuss writing out the harmony for your sketches. So remember when we generated the accompaniment and we figured out, okay, we need to hear orchestrationally, and we found this pretty cool accompaniment, and then we orchestrated it, right? But one of the problems, if you look at the four-hands piano, notice that I stopped at a certain point. Probably this is because I just need to get the idea, and then I want to spend more of the time in the actual orchestration process. But because of my haste, I actually ran into a problem. So notice that the harmony changes. I hadn't realized that in my haste, right? I guess I was just, I wasn't listening at that level, right? I was just trying to get the melody. Now, there are other times where you do hear the harmony and melody at the same time, right? Remember from that second section we orchestrated, that I was hearing immediately the harmony and melody were so linked. But this first section, I wasn't hearing it. And as a consequence, as I was orchestrating and in the flow, I reached a stop. Oh, okay. So here is a pointer: is try to think ahead. I don't know. I think I was just too hasty. Okay. So what I have to do now is I have to sketch out the harmony. Okay. I'm not going to orchestrate directly because there's too many possibilities of making mistakes. I want to know the ambitus. So on a separate piece of paper, I'm going to orchestrate the harmony. So as you can see, I haven't marked any real rhythms in the right hand. It's really just like the chord, so I can kind of situate myself. Let's listen. So now I've figured out the harmony. That probably took me 2 or 3 hours, okay? And again, you see, like, orchestration is expensive. It's really expensive, okay? But it's worth it. So a couple things to point out. Notice that going into the last measure, there's a tritone leap from the E flat to the A natural, Okay. Now, if you're too seeped into harmony and the rules, oh, I can't do that. But actually, when I was composing the harmony, that was intentional. I wanted that stark, that directness. Okay. So that's something to think about. Also notice that at measure 10, the last beat, we have a C minor chord. And previously, we were alternating between kind of a G dominant 7 and an A major chord. It's basically kind of a 5 to 6, doesn't matter, okay? But we were alternating between these two chords, okay? And now on this last beat, instead of having an A flat major chord as we would expect, instead we have a C minor chord. So I took out the A flat and it became a C. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, it's a really subtle change. Now, when I was doing the harmony, I go slow and I listen for that subtle change. But subtle changes are incredibly expensive. They're worth it, but they're really expensive. Why? It is very possible that later on I would think this is a mistake, right? So when I go to orchestrate, if I'm not really looking at the piano score, I'm going more on memory and listening, which we want to do, it's very possible I'll put it A flat. And I noticed when I was orchestrating, I had this confusion, and confusion is going to cost you a lot of time. Also, think about if you put this aside and then maybe you get the performance, right? And then later on, you're looking at the score like, whoa, you're looking at, there's a mistake, but you're not going to know what the right decision is. There's this false aesthetic people have that composers know everything, get to know everything about every piece at any moment. I don't remember, right? The harmony isn't always fresh in our ears, okay? So what I highly suggest is something like that. That's a small micro change, but it's like a precious jewel. You got to leave yourself a note or something so that you don't lose time later on. Another really, really important thing is, and this applies as well to composition, fugue as well, is you have to listen to your harmony up to tempo. So when I was drafting this as piano, of course, I went slower, but I had to listen where is the harmony changing? But one of the problems is if you go slowly and you're not hearing at the right tempo, is that you may think, okay, harmony's got to change on each beat, which in certain tempos makes sense. But obviously this is a rapid tempo, right? It's cut time. So notice that the harmony is actually mostly moving by the half note. It changes, but one of the dangers is when you go work slowly that you think slowly. So make sure when you do this kind of work on a separate piece of paper that then you verify and you listen up the tempo. I think many composers, I suspect that they don't do this step because it's a burden and it's annoying because you just want to be there, whatever there is. But the reality is, in order to be excellent, you have to put in all this work. And orchestration is expensive. All right, let's listen to the Tutti Orchestration. All right, so let's discuss the trumpets. So remember from my piano sketches we did earlier with harmony and with the accompaniment, we figured out that having continuous triplets would be an awesome accompaniment to utilize, in particular because it could work well with strings as well as the brass. Ultimately decided to leave it with just the strings because for the brass, there was just the inevitable reality is that those breaks in the sound when you need to catch a breath would be very audible and kind of disconcerting for the listener. But because of this, I was kind of disappointed, and I was like, this is a really missed opportunity. And that ended up being a blessing in disguise because I was dissatisfied, and I listened, and here is what I got for the trumpets. So notice that they have a commentary role. And this discovery was not possible when I was stuck in that piano sketch. So more than ever, you see my initial hunch to get out of that piano sketch and into the orchestration was very astute. Now let's look at the strings. So notice that they start off 4 parts, though they're sharing a note. And then the viola comes in, and then they go to 5 parts. Let's listen to all the strings together. So some of the things that I was thinking about for the strings, first of all, that distance between the viola and the cello. Now, you could have had a larger distance, but something when I was voicing is just like how far away do I want the viola from the cellos. I also had to think of the ambitus, so the distance from the violin 1 to the double basses. I also was thinking about the interval between the two. So, for example, when we have the double basses on the F, and then I have the violin on the A flat, trying to make sure that the outer voices have kind of a pleasing sound. This comes, of course, from harmony. Now I want to share with you a huge mistake I made that cost me about 2 to 3 hours of work. I'll let you know in a future episode how much work it actually cost me. So if you look at measures, let's say 8 and 9, notice it's alternating between two chords, and one of those chords is a dominant 7 in second inversion. You don't have to know this term, but basically it's a chord that traditionally is very ambiguous. It's kind of a passing chord, but it doesn't matter. I was utilizing it. And when I was working at the piano, I decided, I'm not, since the D is already in the bass, I don't want it in the upper parts. This, of course, comes out of this understanding of harmony. I talked about it in a video, I think it was called The Line of Demarcation, basically in which when you have your bass, certain times when the bass is on a certain important note, you don't want to repeat that bass in a higher partial because it could create a confusion of harmony. In this case, I decided it was going to create a dullness of harmony if I had that D in the other parts. But if you look at the strings, you'll see, in fact, I do have that D. And the reason for that is I had come to this discovery, and then I didn't write myself a note. And worse than that, I ended my composition session and I completely forgot. So then later when I went to do the voice leading and to orchestrate this, I had that D, which I decided I do not want in the strings, and now I have a faulty orchestration. Now, it's not going to sound bad, okay, but definitely when I was working very intimately, there was a kind of a loss of luster. For example, if you look in the woodwinds, you'll notice I'm avoiding that D, okay? So it's definitely not what I wanted. So what I recommend in the future is that you write yourself a note, you write a really clear note, write it really big. Also, something to keep in mind is we sometimes think that, I'll get to it later. Like in this case, I thought, okay, it's Saturday, I'm going to take a break. And I thought later I get back to composition. It never happens. Unfortunately, sometimes all we have is that one session and then we're done. So now because of this mistake, and I didn't voice it as I actually hearing it, I'm going to have to look at the strings again. I may have to adjust the woodwinds to accommodate the strings. I'm going to have to adjust the trumpets. It's going to be, could be 2 to 3 hours of work. All right, to wrap it up, I want to look at the woodwinds. Here especially, I think we see why it was so necessary to get out of the piano sketch. So I can't tell you exactly what was going through my head and how I got to this because I was composing, I wasn't analyzing what I was doing. But basically what I can say is the woodwinds is a direct response of the harmony, knowing the harmony. So I have kind of the flutes and oboes have this commentary. And then there's like a call and response with the clarinets and the French horns, which kind of act like a woodwind here. And then they do these triplets and become their own independent voice. And the only way I was able to get to this solution was by getting out of the piano score, getting out of the piano sketches, and getting into the actual orchestration. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you want to get better orchestration right this second, I highly recommend that you shut off YouTube and you go straight into orchestration. Forget everything I said and just go ahead, compose, and orchestrate. If you want to do a little bit of a target study, then you can watch my How the French Learn Orchestration series. Have a great day.